Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. I'd like to talk with you about the very important letter of First Corinthians. As you can see on the map there, the city of Corinth is found in the southern peninsula of Greece. There, it's in the province of Achaia, near Corinth, on the left side of the map there. I've given you Paul's second missionary journey. This is that missionary journey that is recorded for us in the book of Acts, where Paul first went to the mainland Greece when he went over to Philippi. That's the northern part of Greece there. And then he came down to the southern part and started this little church at Corinth. It's a very important church. Paul writes two letters to the church in Corinth, and these letters are very instructive. So let's take a look at this first letter to the Corinthians that Paul wrote after he had established this church on his second missionary journey. So Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthian church. This is among those letters of Paul that is undisputed. You remember that we divided Paul's letters up into disputed and undisputed. This is one of those that the vast majority of all scholars believe is an authentic Pauline letter, as it says in chapter 1 and verse 1. It was written in 55 AD from Ephesus, a city that's across the Aegean Sea from the Greek mainland. Paul is there on his third missionary journey, and he's heard about some problems from across the Aegean Sea, and so he writes this letter to respond to those problems. A theme is unity in the local church. There's all kinds of disunity in the church in Corinth. It's caused by a host of issues, and Paul is going to try to fix those issues, all for the purposes of bringing the church back into unity. And the occasion, the reason why he's writing it, is because he's heard of a number of problems at the church in Corinth. So what was the city of Corinth like? What kind of challenges did it present to early Christians trying to be faithful to Jesus Christ in this cosmopolitan place? It was a leading center of commerce and education, a lot of business going on, a lot of trade. It was at a juncture of a couple of seaports. It was a very well-traveled landmass, centrally located place in the Mediterranean. A lot of people traveling to Corinth to go get educated. So there are people there from all over the Mediterranean world. It was also a noted sports center. The Isthmian Games were held there every 2 years, while over in Athens they were having the Olympic Games. Paul probably makes reference to this kind of athletic striving and metaphor competition in chapter 9, verses 24 through 7. It was a very populous city. About 700,000 people probably lived there at the time Paul established the church. So this is a very large city for its time. Corinth had, over the centuries prior to Paul being there, had developed a reputation for being an unusually pagan city. The temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, was prominent in the city. You can imagine a city devoting itself to love and beauty would also likely be very open to a certain kind of excess and decadence. In addition to the other gods and goddesses who were worshipped in Corinth. As you know, Greek cities often gave their devotion to a number of different gods and goddesses. Corinth was such a pagan city and wicked city prior to Paul being there, a couple of centuries before, that a figure of speech developed that said that if you're a particularly wicked person, no matter where you lived, you might be called a Corinthian. So you can see how this idea of being a Corinthian, it may have still been with them at the time of Paul, and their earlier practices had labeled this city as being particularly decadent. So maybe, I'm trying to think about analogies to our own day, maybe think of Las Vegas, at least at certain points in its history. So Corinth was a bustling cosmopolitan city, a kind of Los Angeles, New York, and Las Vegas all rolled into one. So it was a really challenging place to be a Christian and to be a faithful one. So where did the church of Corinth come from? Well, Paul had started this church when he was on his second missionary journey. He had traveled through northern Greece, come down to the city of Athens and preached a sermon that's recorded in Acts chapter 17. And then he went to a city that's nearby there called Corinth. And there, a number of people were converted to Christ. So he had started this church on a second missionary journey. They knew him personally. They looked at him as the founder of their church, second only to Christ himself. And Paul, while he was there, had stayed in the home of Aquila and Priscilla, a prominent husband and wife team of teachers who are referenced a number of times in the New Testament as being important leaders and teachers, both of them, both the husband and the wife, of other people. And so Paul had stayed there and had been shown hospitality by them, taken care of, and they had formed a core of the church there at Corinth. But why was Paul writing? Well, reports have come from another prominent family, the family of Chloe, a female name, telling him of some serious problems in the church. Chloe was apparently a female leader in the early church who had some leadership role. We don't know what that was, but she was apparently an influential person. In addition to this report from Chloe, Paul has received a delegation of people, has brought him a letter asking him a series of questions. And so he's going to respond to these questions and reports in this letter. What were those oral reports about? What were they concerned with? Well, the oral reports have come to Paul. How do we know, and what were they? Well, Paul makes reference to them in 1 Corinthians. Chapter 1, it has been reported to me there are quarrels among you. They're having fighting, arguing. It's actually reported there is sexual immorality among you. Chapter 5, I hear that there are divisions among you about the Lord's Supper. Paul responds by writing a letter and sending Timothy then to make an oral response. So he's heard these reports and he's going to respond back to them. So that's the oral reports. We can also, by taking a look at 1 Corinthians, piece together what may have been in the questions that were in a letter that they sent him. So what were the questions in that letter that Paul received from Corinth? Here, Paul appears to go through their questions one at a time. And we can see this clearly in his response to them, 1 Corinthians. Chapter 7, now concerning the virgins. Now concerning food offered to idols in chapter 8. Chapter 12, now concerning spiritual gifts. Chapter 16, now concerning the collection. And then finally again in chapter 16 and verse 12, now concerning Apollos. It seems that they had after asked him a series of questions, and he's responding as if he has the letter from them right in front of them, and he's going in order. Now concerning, now concerning, now concerning. So how does he respond to them? Paul responds to the Corinthian assertions. Apparently, in this letter he received, they are asserting certain kinds of things, and we can tell this by the contents of 1 Corinthians, where Paul answers those assertions back. In other words, in 1 Corinthians, he quotes his Corinthian brothers and sisters in order to respond to them. Here's an example. Chapter 1, verse 12. I belong to Paul. I belong to Apollos. I belong to Cephas. I belong to Christ. Paul responds, has Christ been divided? So this gives us insight into that there were factions, cliques, if you will, in the church in Corinth. I'm gathered around Paul. That group is around Apollos. Others are around Cephas, Peter. Others are following Christ. They're the real pious ones. And Paul answers by saying, look, why do we have factions? Aren't we all following Christ, no matter what leader is influential? Later he says, all things are lawful for me. That's Paul probably quoting the Corinthians. Some of them thinks everything's lawful, so they can do anything. Paul responds by saying, well, everything might be lawful, but it's not all beneficial. All things are lawful, but you will not be dominated by anything, will you? All of us possess knowledge. Well, knowledge is good, but love is the better thing to have. So you can see that Paul is using their letter, responding to their concerns, but at the same time, the way he responds gives us, the readers, insight into what were the particular problems in Corinth. So let's take a look at how this letter is outlined. So here in outline form is the book of 1 Corinthians, and I'll use this outline to talk about some of the topics in the book. We have an introduction where Paul introduces himself. Remember, he's not introducing himself. They already know him. He's simply identifying that it's Paul who's writing, and he thanks them. And we have that normal opening of the letter. And then he jumps into this notion of factions. We've already looked at that. There were cliques in the church in Corinth. When you read 1 Corinthians, you find out that this church is suffering a lot of problems. They have problems with factions and lack of discipline and moral problems and pride and arrogance and materialism and all kinds of things. It actually looks like a lot of the churches that you and I attend. The problems that they have are not that different from our own. They're just different in degree, but not in kind. So the church in Corinth was plagued by cliques, factions. They also have a lack of church discipline going on. There are moral problems among the members, and the church is not acting. Paul criticizes the church for failure to discipline a member who's violating sexual norms in chapter 5. There's a member of the church, apparently, who is sleeping with his mother-in-law. And Paul says this kind of sin isn't even found among the pagans, but the Corinthian believers are open and accepting of it. They think it's fine. Paul is angry with this member, but he is even more angry with the church who tolerates it. And then you've got people who apparently think it's fine to go to prostitutes or to practice materialism. And Paul is responding to all of these things. Problems in the church. Personal behavior, marriage and celibacy, meat offered to idols. We'll get to some detail on marriage and celibacy, but apparently there were some Christians who had questions about, if I am a Christian believer and my spouse is not, should I stay married to that person? And if I do stay married to that person, is sex within the bonds of that marriage still permissible? So Paul writes to respond, and in chapter 7 he says, if you are married to someone who's not a Christian, pray for them, hope that they become a Christian, but if they want a divorce, then that's permissible. But if you stay within the bonds of marriage, your sexual practices within the bonds of that marriage between a man and a woman are permissible. And so he has to weigh in on that particular issue. And then he talks about the importance of celibacy, at least for some, that everyone should remain celibate outside the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman. And he calls singleness, which means also celibacy, a gift. And then there's the problem of meat offered to idols. We've looked at that in the previous classes, where, remember, meat is being sacrificed in both the temples and being sold in the marketplace. And Paul has already said, no, you can't eat the meat that's up in the temples, but you can eat it if you buy it in the market. But even there are conditions there. You shouldn't offend a weaker brother. So he's got to deal with issues having to deal with personal behavior. Apparently, some people are treating others as if they don't matter. And so that's what he's got to deal with here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And then you have the matters of public worship that he deals with. The veiling of women, a very cryptic passage that has confused many Bible interpreters as to what's happening there. There's questions of love feasts, which were probably early forms of a kind of potluck supper. Apparently some people were showing up for the potluck supper. They were eating all the food, and for those who showed up a little bit later, there was no food to eat. And this was causing no small argument and factions within the church. And then there's misunderstanding or perhaps even abuse of the Lord's Supper. And then in chapters 12 through 14, Paul deals with the use of miraculous gifts during worship. Many people in the Corinthian church were gifted with spiritual gifts, say the gift of speaking in tongues. And apparently they were getting up not all at once, but perhaps many at a time, and all speaking in tongues at the same time. And this is causing, as you can imagine, a great deal of confusion in a worship service. And it seemed to have been an opportunity for people to show off. In the midst of talking about those miraculous gifts in chapter 12 through 14, Paul places this famous love chapter that you've no doubt heard quoted at weddings. Love is patient, love is kind, love seeks not its own. And then at the end of the chapter, the greatest of these is love. That's a wonderful passage of Scripture to use for a wedding, but its first usage was not romantic love between a man and a woman, but rather the love that should be exercised between members of a church when we think about how we use our spiritual gifts. That we should defer to the issue of love and not towards showing off or trying to show our spiritual superiority. Also in chapter 15, we find that there apparently is doctrinal confusion about the resurrection. Here Paul teaches in these 19 verses that Christ was raised bodily. And those who believe that Jesus wasn't raised bodily are not only in error, but such a belief undermines the entire gospel. Now, when we read Paul's letters, as I've mentioned before in class, we're reading other people's mail. So we have to read between the lines. In this particular case, when Paul teaches about the resurrection and insists that Christ was bodily raised, we should probably assume that there are some people in Corinth who think that the resurrection of Christ was not a bodily one. We're not sure exactly what they thought, but Paul insists that Christ's resurrection was a physical one. He physically rose from the grave. And moreover, if you don't believe this, and apparently some Corinthians didn't believe that, they probably believed in a spiritual resurrection. But if you don't believe in a physical resurrection, then Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that our belief is in vain, that is, what he is preaching is false. But then he also says that we are of all people most miserable. Because if Christ isn't raised, then the gospel is not true and we are not saved. The reason why the resurrection is so important to Paul, and it's important to Christians, is because Jesus came to save human beings, not human souls. I've mentioned before that the Christian hope is not to be a disembodied spirit enjoying the bliss of an eternal heaven. It is rather to live in a resurrected physical body on a physical earth, a new heaven and a new earth in the kingdom of heaven. So if the physical resurrection isn't true, then human beings are not saved. Maybe human souls, but not human beings. Our bodies are important. Paul goes on in this chapter and says that the resurrection of Christians is something that has not happened yet. It happens after physical death because it's a physical resurrection. And Christians have hope because Christ indeed was raised physically. Now again, Paul's points here should let us know that there are at least some people in the Corinthian church who didn't believe in a physical resurrection. They probably believed in a kind of spiritual resurrection. And as we'll say in a moment, as I'll say in just a moment, they probably believed that they had already experienced the resurrection. Then in chapter 16, Paul concludes the letter, commends them once again, and sends Timothy to read the letter to them and to represent him. Let's talk for a few minutes about some characteristics of 1 Corinthians. Well, it deals with a variety of topics, as we've seen: factions, materialism, sex, marriage, singleness, Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts, love, obeying the government. All kinds of things are in the book of 1 Corinthians. A lot of the issues they dealt with, we deal with today. How to relate to your culture. How should we obey authorities? What should be our responsibilities towards other Christian believers? How should we treat people who aren't Christians? All kinds of things that Paul deals with in this letter that we don't have a lot of time to talk about. Paul applied the theology then to address these problems in the church. In the book of 1 Corinthians, we get a rather exhaustive discussion of marriage, of sex and its goodness within the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman, and the goodness of being single as well. We also get that noble characterization of Christian love that we saw in chapter 13. And then finally, a characteristic of 1 Corinthians is an emphasis upon the resurrection. Indeed, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the most thorough treatment of the doctrine of the resurrection we find in all the New Testament. It's also important to remind ourselves that when we read this book, when it talks about, say, the Lord's Supper in chapter 11, or the resurrection in chapter 15, that those are the first or earliest recorded testimonies to the Lord's Supper and the resurrection. Remember, the gospel accounts that record the resurrection and the Lord's Supper were written after Paul penned these letters. So this is the earliest treatment we get of both of these issues. And in regard to the resurrection, it's the most thorough treatment. So when we think about all those problems that the church was plagued with in Corinth, many scholars have attempted to suggest that there was some underlying reason why they're having all these problems. Is there an underlying cause that might give rise to them? And what they've suggested, at least some have, is called over-realized eschatology. Now, eschatology, it may have been a word that you've seen before. It means last things. So eschatology refers to the last things like when does the Lord return, but it also has to do with the resurrection. So if you have an over-realized eschatology, it means you think certain things have already happened early, that it's already happening now and not something that's going to happen in the future. So one aspect of this would be a way of explaining some of these underlying issues. Let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that some Corinthian believers thought that they were already experiencing the resurrection. Not in its physical form. That's something they don't believe in, at least some don't believe in. But what if they believed they were already spiritually resurrected? That somehow their bodies they have now are already spirit bodies and they're experiencing the resurrection. Might that be a key that unlocks some of these problems, explains them? Some have suggested that the confusion about the resurrection might lead to a number of problems. Pride and arrogance. If you think you have already experienced resurrection and I haven't, you might conclude that you're better than I am. It might lead to pride and arrogance, a lack of concern for others. Belief that the physical body doesn't matter. If I already believe I have a physical body, or if a Christian already believes they have a resurrected body, they might be led into two kinds of errors. One, the thought that that a person could have sex with whomever they wanted if they're already living in a resurrected body. So Paul deals with sex with prostitutes in chapter 6. He deals with sex outside the bonds of marriage also in chapter 6. Maybe they think it's perfectly fine, even for Christians, because they're already in a kind of resurrected body. And it doesn't matter what you do with this physical one. The other possibility that could lead to is complete abstinence within marriage. If people began to think that they're already in resurrected bodies, then one, the physical body might be something they want to do away with or starve in terms of food or in terms of sex within the bonds of marriage. And so a theological error about the resurrection, if I believe I've already been raised, already experiencing it, it might help explain why some people thought it was okay to indulge in the physical kinds of things, or others who thought it was even better to abstain from those kinds of things. So if this is right, Paul corrects their view about the resurrection and gives the correct teaching about a host of issues that have arisen because of their over-realized eschatology. So if this is true, let's apply it to a chapter in 1 Corinthians and see how it would work. So here's an example of over-realized eschatology in chapter 7. Apparently some Corinthians are saying this: it is well for a man not to touch a woman. And what he means by this is it's well for a married man not to touch his wife. So apparently there were some Corinthian believers who, for whatever reason, thought that they should abstain from sex even within the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman who were both Christians. So the issue here is, should Christians be celibate even in marriage? And some Christians thought they should be. Now, why would they think that? Well, over-realized eschatology. If we're already living in our spirit bodies, did not Jesus himself say that in heaven we will neither be in marriage nor given in marriage? And so if you're already experiencing heaven in your spirit resurrected body, one might conclude that a couple should abstain from sex within the bonds of marriage. And that is apparently what some were doing. And so Paul responds to this. Paul responds by saying marital